It's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to Riggs Library, to this place devoted to scholarship and the search for truth, for a literary conversation on the resurrection of the ordinary. And we're especially pleased to welcome to Georgetown Pulitzer Prize winning novelist Marilynne Robinson, as well as a frequent visitor to the Hilltop, author Paul Elie. These are authors who have both demonstrated how faith and religion can affect, influence, and impact artistic creation. Authors who have striven, in the words of the late John Paul II in his letter to artists, to, quote, search for new epiphanies of beauty, close quote, and authors who have both discussed how our worldview and a culture can be shaped by faith, whether it be through the Catholic imagination or, as Marilynne Robinson stated in Religion and Ethics News Weekly, the Protestant imagination. The title of today's conversation is taken from Marilynne Robinson's first book, Housekeeping, which received the PEN Hemingway Award for Best First Novel, was nominated for a Pulitzer, and was judged by the Atlantic Monthly as, quote, one of the 10 best novels of the past century. At one point in the novel, the main character, Ruth, feels that the wind that billowed her grandmother's sheets announced to her the resurrection of the ordinary, and that her grandmother performed the rituals of the ordinary as an act of faith. This observation takes place in the mountains of Idaho. However, it very much echoes the wisdom of the early desert fathers who went into the deserts of the Middle East and first wrote, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, discusses in Silence and Honey Cakes, that mundane tasks are also true acts of religious faith. Additionally, the idea that we can find God, God's presence, God's meaning, and the most ordinary of things, that we can find God in the most mundane tasks, in other words, that we can find God everywhere, is very much in keeping with the spiritual tradition of the Jesuits and their founder, St. Ignatius of Loyola. As one Jesuit, the philosopher and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin wrote in The Divine Milieu, God awaits us every instant in our action and the work of the moment. There is a sense in which he is at the tip of my pen, my spade, my brush, my needle. I've had the privilege of teaching essays from Marilynne Robinson's collection, The Death of Adam, for several years in philosophy classes. Her writing is filled with themes of culture and Christianity, religion and redemption, salvation and spirituality, and the presence of God and the ordinary in all things. Her work offers a unique perspective on engaging the dialogue between faith and culture, and advancing that dialogue is something that we're very committed to here at Georgetown. Given her writing, her infusion of faith in the ordinary, it's probably not surprising that she's a deeply religious person. She serves as a deacon in her congregational church. She's also very interested in theology and scripture. In The Death of Adam, as noted in the New York Times Book Review, she defends the Puritan tradition as one, quote, devoted to social justice, universal education, and a chastening knowledge of human fallibility. She was born in Sandpoint, Idaho. She received her BA from Brown University and her PhD in English from the University of Washington. And she's been writer-in-residence or visiting professor at numerous universities, and is best known for her work at the famed Iowa Writers' Workshop. In addition to Housekeeping, Gilead won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2005 and the National Book Critics Circle Award. She was a finalist for the National Book Award for a nonfiction piece, Mother Country, Britain, the Welfare State, and Nuclear Pollution. And just last year, Home was another finalist for the National Book Award. Now, the perfect partner to Marilynne Robinson in our literary conversation this afternoon is a frequent guest to the Hilltop, Paul Elie, someone whose writing also offers a unique perspective on the engagement of faith and culture. Paul has been with us over the course of this past year on a couple of occasions, first when he gave a lecture on Catholic culture in a critical age, 45 years after a lecture by Flannery OConnor that helped mark the 175th anniversary of Georgetown. He also joined us in February when he engaged in a literary conversation with author Ron Hansen about the great English poet and Jesuit priest Gerard Manley Hopkins and the Catholic Imagination. During his visits with us, he has discussed his first book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, a title taken from a Flannery OConnor short story, and the work focuses on the influential Catholic literary figures of the 20th century, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Flannery OConnor, and Walker Percy. For 3 decades, the four corresponded, read one another's work, grappled with the demands of faith and art, and shaped the American perception of Catholicism and the Catholic imagination through their writing. Paul's book seems the natural outcome for someone who, like Marilynne Robinson, is very much dedicated to both his faith and his art. He received his BA from Fordham University, where he studied not only theology and philosophy, but also English and art. And after receiving his MFA from Columbia, he became an editor at Farrar, Strauss and Giroux. His writing appears in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Atlantic Monthly, and many other publications. Marilynne and Paul's works speak to the place of faith in modern culture, to the creative capacity of human beings, which John Calvin believed is the proof of the existence of a soul, and perhaps most importantly, to the power of both faith and books. It is truly an honor and a privilege this afternoon to welcome you to today's conversation and to introduce to you Marilynne Robinson and Paul Elie.
Thank you very much, President DeGioia. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and to pose the questions that I've wanted to pose ever since I started reading your work in the late 80s. The job that I now hold, I got in part because I'd read Housekeeping twice, which counted for something at FSG, because that's where I work and that's also Marilynne Robinson's publisher. That book opens with an image of an outsider artist, Ruth and Lucille's grandfather, painting mountains found only in his imagination. You are, in many ways, an outsider artist. Your essays are contrarian in spirit, your novels unfashionable in their subject matter, and in the reverent attention paid to it. And yet, you are now recognized as one of our greatest writers. You have many readers, as well as many prizes. The President has your work at his bedside. What has it been like to be so recognized in our society for work that is such a challenge to our society?
Well, you know, I think that it might be overgeneral to say that it is a challenge to our society. My experience is that there is a very thin and brittle surface that we take to be American society, and that beneath that there are people dreaming and living and responding to what they find beautiful and suffering injuries and being melancholy and being full of joy and all that sort of thing, that we're just human beings, you know. We're just human beings in a culture that has a sort of carapace over it. It's something that forbids acknowledgement of what I think most of us actually feel. So I don't feel as if I am contrarian. I feel as if everyone else is. No, that's, that's an exaggeration. But I do think that there is a great deal in the culture that abrades and offends people in general. And that for some reason we're all in on this. We collude in perpetuating ideas that in some odd way are sort of alien to us, you know?
So your experience, let's say since Gilead came out, you've encountered readers who've read the novel with a sense of recognition, something intuitive but not uttered?
Yes, or even uttered. One of the things that's been very moving to me about Gilead as an experience is that many people say, it was important to me because, and then they tell me something absolutely circumstantial or specific to them. It's what they are going through at the time that they read it, or what it makes them remember, or whatever, you know. That more than other books that I had written, and only one novel, of course, before that, it seems somehow or other to sort of fit into people's lives when they value it. And that kind of confirms my theory that I'm not really outside the culture. I just have another entry into it.
Your work puts in mind a description of Faulkner's work, maybe a description that came from Faulkner himself, oratory out of solitude. Is Faulkner an influence?
Well, I admire Faulkner. He's definitely one of the greatest American writers, or one of the greatest world writers. But I couldn't, it's hard to talk about being influenced by Faulkner because he's so overpowering that even a fragment of influence by him, I think, would stand out, from the fabric of what I do. I think any writer that you can really wholeheartedly admire is an influence in his own way.
So how about the solitude part of the definition? As you've tried to point out, you don't see yourself as an outsider, and yet the sense of inwardness or the sense of a powerful, cultivated aloneness is so strong in all the books. Is there a place for that solitude? Does the work emerge from a kind of solitude?
I think, I would say that it does, actually. I think that it's partly a consequence of my own cultural origins, that solitude was considered a pleasure, not an affliction. And that in a certain way you kind of lived in order to be a better connoisseur of your own solitude. To be at peace with yourself, to be devoted to whatever actually interests you, That to me is a powerful, positive thing. And I do speak out of solitude. That's a fact. I do.
And one of the things that emerges in the books is the confidence of your characters to cultivate solitude. They're not writers in the sense that you are, but the respect they have for their own imagination, for the cultivation of the mind just for its own sake, I think has been very striking to many readers. Is that something you sought to do, or?
It is something that I always seek to do. I always tell my students or anybody else who has my attention, and here you are, that the human mind is the most complex object known to exist in the universe. You find that said in many, many contexts, the human brain, that is, as a physical object. Now, what an extraordinary privilege it is that we are in constant conversation with this most complex object in the universe. Every one of us is. And nobody knows what the mind can do. Its potentialities are unexhausted, untested, really. But they certainly, they're there for anyone to explore, And I just, I think that people, if they cherish their inwardness more consciously, they cherish a great deal more beside. Part of it being ordinary experience, which becomes transcendent in a way. If you think, what a privilege I in this moment encounter this object, this obligation, this emotion.
The phrase, as Jack mentioned, the resurrection of the ordinary comes from Housekeeping. By the time we get to Gilead, it seems to Reverend Ames, I would venture to say he doesn't even have a sense of the ordinary. His sense of what's extraordinary is so constant. Is there a difference? Is the ordinary something that's merely misnamed, or does it take something to resurrect or to transform the ordinary into something incandescent?
Well, my own feeling is that it is of its nature incandescent, and that we disparage or ignore things, that have an enormous potency if we simply notice what they are. The little acts that people carry out for each other's comfort are absolutely beautiful. I mean, if you were to think of yourself looking back on life, I think that some of the things that would please you most deeply are that at some moment you comforted your child, or in one way or another you soothed, you fed, you were adequate. These things are very beautiful, and I think sacramental. And I mean, that's only one instance of a general phenomenon.
A number of us in the room have 7-year-old sons, and I think we would think those sons incredibly fortunate if they had such a document as Reverend Ames's letter addressed to them. The letter itself is a kind of blessing. Is that what you were after with the book?
Yes. I mean, I use this sort of Old Testament motif of the blessing of sons by fathers, you know, Esau and Jacob and all of that. And I think that, I've been fascinated by the idea of blessing because it implies an extraordinary benevolent power invested in one person relative to another, you know. There's something, you know, so that if you were to tell a memory, it would be an entirely different thing from the idea that perhaps you bless someone by giving them the memory, you know. There's a qualitative change that occurs when any gesture is made or any deed is done under that aspect, I think.
And as Reverend Ames puts it in the book, it's not that he delivers something over to the person he's blessing, it's that it's happening from outside both of them, but he is, I don't have the term, the conduit for it or the witness to it. How would you put it?
Well, he feels blessing as a consecrated act, as something that, the intention to bless, the intention to receive blessing are things that he thinks of as sacred in God's eyes, you know. And so he's participating in something that is just intrinsically, profoundly real and good.
When you look at the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament also, blessing is the stuff of profound narrative, again and again and again. And yet, you suggested earlier today that if you'd said that this novel about a certain blessing that an old pastor wanted to confer onto his young son was the subject of a novel, that people would furrow their brows. I thought of, in this connection with Flannery OConnor, and especially with her second novel, The Violent Bear It Away, O'Connor said about that book, which has to do with the baptism, the novelist writes to render his vision so that it can be transferred as nearly whole as possible to the reader. Your problem is going to be difficult in direct proportion as your beliefs depart from his. And she, from there, stated the challenge for the novelist of making a baptism register in the reader's mind as something that really counts. Were you familiar with her way of posing the problem when you set out to do this in your own work?
I can't claim to have been.
And so you just found yourself working on a similar track without any knowledge of how this figures in her work?
It actually came from going to church, an honorable tradition. I was always struck by the benediction, because people seemed solemn and moved at that moment, you know, which is, you know, a few seconds, a few words, you know. But when the pastor made the gesture of blessing, the people seemed to feel blessed, which I thought was a beautiful thing and stayed very much in my mind. A lot of what I write about comes from just watching, you know, as opposed to having literary deads, although I have lots of those too.
So you mean you were interested in blessing as a person, and you didn't identify this as the crux of dramatic action in fiction and look for a way to work it out in a piece of writing?
No, I would think of it more as finding a way to explore it by writing, you know. I mean, the whole book from my point of view is, as you said, the blessing of the son, you know, the blessing of the 7-year-old. And so everything in it, in a certain sense, has that character, at least so long as John Ames is writing as he intends to write, you know. So the whole book, in a sense, is an exploration of the idea of blessing, and then, of course, it ends with a blessing.
So as you're working, you begin with an intuition about blessing, and there's lots of theology about blessing, and some of that's gone over by Ames and Boughton, and then you're figuring out more for yourself as a writer about what a blessing is, or can you tell us a little about that act of discovery?
Well, I think that I'm finding out for myself as a Christian what blessing is, you know. I mean, I am who I am, and then I write to explore what that means, you know. I don't think much of anything that's important to me. I think of as being important in itself, and I tend not to think of it, exploiting it as writing at all. But if it's on my mind when I'm writing, or if it's something that's a sort of active mystery in my mind, then I write as a way of exploring it.
So just to summarize a bit, a movement of Gilead, because I'm imagining that most of you have read it, Reverend Ames is presented, in effect, with a godson at the moment when he is supposed to confer the blessing on him. This is upsetting to him, and on some level he's concerned that the blessing that he gave didn't go right, and so the boy's life didn't go right. He wants to bless him again in a way that's theologically sound, but also true to his experience. And that comes 240-some pages after the book begins. Did you know, if I've gotten that right, did you know you were going there, or?
No. Maybe I did at some level, but basically, I mean, I always liked Jack, you know? I mean, but insofar as in me lies, I do not anticipate the ending of any book. Home was, you know, had the rules set basically by Gilead. But the first two books, I just wrote them in the way that they seemed naturally to want to go. And they would have ended otherwise if I'd gotten other signals from the text, you know.
So it was a matter of saying to yourself, what would Reverend Ames want here, or what would Jack require of him? It seems so beautifully realized that I don't want to banish the mystery of it, but at the same time, that's something we can learn from you, how you could work in the dark and wind up with something so full of light.
The dark is full of light. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm always trying to tell my students. Write from your deeper mind, you know. See what comes to the page and respond to what, like a painter would see what comes to the canvas, in effect, and respond to what the, you know, in a dialectical relationship, in effect, between the made thing and the writer. The intensity of concentration very much comes from accepting the authority of the text as something that talks back to you, you know. I mean, I think that from the beginning, just because of the givens of Gilead, it had blessing as a theme, and therefore naturally came to that ultimate blessing, you know. But I never anticipated it or articulated it to myself in those terms.
But it's in this sense that your reading in theology, your own Christian faith, that's a kind of pressure on the text that even though you're responding to the text, you made it. And so, again, I'm just trying to establish what you're suggesting, that you didn't set out to write a Christian novel in which these themes would be worked out. You followed intuition and interest, and wound up with Reverend Ames blessing Jack as an adult.
Yes. That pretty well sums it up.
You say in The Death of Adam that a politician who uses a word that suggests he's been to college, or assumes anyone in his audience has read a book, is ridiculed in the press, not only for pretentiousness, but for in effect speaking gibberish. And now we have such a president, and he's widely admired, and he's an admirer of your work. Have you ever heard from him or been in touch with him?
I can't tell you how many opportunities he's given me to buy his T-shirts. Aside from that, no. But nothing warms my heart more than the fact that he likes my book.
When you talk about a president inviting ridicule for undertaking to speak to people in that way, I think a few years ago you might have invited a kind of ridicule for saying you were going to write a book whose animating concern was personal holiness. You call it, in an essay, what I might call personal holiness is in fact openness to the perception of the holy in existence itself, and above all, in one another. Why should that idea be so strange? Why should it be considered so alien and against the grain?
You know, it just, I don't know that it is. I mean, I don't think this country knows itself very well. My preoccupations are what they are, you know, but, and I write from them, and then people read the book and they seem to recognize many things in the books, you know. So, I mean, that's a learning experience for me. But I think that when we have managed, we, the most religious of the advanced countries, have managed to make religion something that it's excruciatingly difficult to talk about. And, you know, that's some peculiarity of our culture. I don't know, maybe it has sound, you know, reasons behind it, like the fact that religion can be the basis of conflict, and we don't want to expose ourselves to the possibility of religious conflict to the extent that we can avoid it. But, you know, so many people are religious, and whether or not they know how to find expression for their religious impulses, they are still religious. You know, the idea that there's some sort of hostile secularism that is besieging religion in America, I think to the extent that that's true, a great reason for it is because we treat the culture that way. You know, people are taught that there would be some sort of risk involved in writing about a character who is religious in a central way, you know. We act as if it were a guilty secret or something like that, you know, or something that simply could not be articulated intellectually, although frankly Christian theology is as strong an intellectual tradition as any in the world. Why do we do that? Why do we act as if people are not interested in something that we know overwhelmingly they're deeply interested in? I don't know.
And you've suggested at a number of points that Christians are themselves complicit in this, becoming defensive, assuming that certain subjects are off the table. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's very true. Not only that, but you know, you know, you pass people on the street, you have no idea what's going on in their minds, you know. I think that there's a habit among a lot of people to just say secular. You know, I teach in a secular university, the University of Iowa. A lot of secular people, you know, are just as religious as anybody in this room. You know, there are these sort of broad generalizations about the state of the culture and the temper of the times and so on that don't bear up well under any slight acquaintance with them at all. And I think that I mean, I self-identify obviously as a religious person, but I don't know anything about what other people believe. And if there's a sort of an aggressive, hostile assumption behind our treatment of the culture at large, then we are marginalizing ourselves and making ourselves look defensive and bitter and all the rest of it. It's completely self-defeating. And I think unchristian. We don't have any right to assume the things we assume about the culture at large.
There's a point in both Gilead and Home in which an article is passed from one pastor to the other, supposedly from Ladies' Home Journal, that points out that 95% of Americans identify themselves as religious, and then finds fault with this vapid religiosity, supposedly vapid in all sorts of ways. To me, my own suspicion has been that some of the problem you describe has to do with sociology. We're trying to see the whole, and we don't attend to what the convictions are of the person next to us or the stranger. Instead, we want to generalize about 300 million Americans. Is that part of the problem?
I think absolutely it is, and that did come from Ladies' Home Journal.
1948.
And that appalling salad was completely authentic.
Who is it that said you couldn't understand that part of the Middle West without understanding molded gelatin?
A wise man.
I'm thinking of another aphorism of Faulkner's, what he said about the past not even being dead, it's not even past. There seem to be a number of writers working at a high level now whose work is not historical fiction, but it deals with the past, a past that isn't past. I'm thinking of Toni Morrison. I'm thinking of Cormac McCarthy. I'm thinking of Alice McDermott. none of them historical novelists, and yet the sense of the past as material that can be treated, can be written about now in ways that it couldn't have been written about then. And I see some kinship between them and you. Is there anything to that?
Well, I think that one of the things that is characteristic of this country is that it has basically a sort of uncanonical cultural life, in the sense that it's always going back and making new statements about its culture and its history and so on. And these things, frankly, they often have the character of fads, you know, which in a way only stimulates curiosity, renews curiosity about the past if you don't believe the narrative you are being told at any given time. But we do have an interesting history, one that happened very rapidly. And I mean, it's like the beginning of the universe, you know, so many of the dominant features of the culture clicked in so quickly, you know, in a period of a couple hundred years, which is a wink in terms of human history. And here we are now, and here we are unbelievably responsible for the well-being of the world. Everything, whether we succeed, we're responsible. Whether we fail, we're more responsible, you know. And the question is how, you know, who are we? What have we done here? What are our operative assumptions? Where are we blind, you know? And I think that all of that really stimulates an effort to re-articulate and find something true to say about our very abrupt past.
So what I'm hearing you say, well, let me put an idea out there that, following on what you've just said. So many people, when Gilead and Home were published, treated these as books about the past, but in important ways, you could say that these are books, that it's not really the past, that 1956 is not that long ago. There are continuities with the present that outweigh the discontinuities?
Absolutely. And there's also the fact of the great lesson of the Civil War and the period afterward is that we can do the right thing for the right reason and then lose all historical memory of what was done, why it was done, you know. So that you have this horrible falling backward that occurs in the Reconstruction period and after. And so that we have to live through this whole sort of nightmare again, you know. And I think that you know, knowing the past doesn't protect you from repeating it. That's not true at all. But I think that just from the point of view of our wanting to have a certain integrity and authenticity in living American lives, that we have to look at our fallibilities, you know. And we have to begin to see where perhaps we're letting something turn over and become the opposite of itself, because our history demonstrates a huge potentiality for that.
There's a point in Gilead where Reverend Ames refers to a radio evangelist with a theological sense of a jackrabbit and says, I do wonder where it will end. And in a sense, I hear you saying that it ended with a lack of memory about the good things that have been done in the name of Christianity in the time in which those books are set?
I think that's it has had a big impact. That kind of media-driven religion has tended toward show business, simplification, you know, not preparing people to, you know, our great gift is that we have a fantastic theology and a fantastic body of art and music. All of it, or not all of it, but most of it extraordinarily deep, complex. But people have to be, in a way, educated to hear and see what they're given by those kinds of traditions. And what we've had for a very long time is a sort of popularization in the very negative sense. You know, lots of great religious movements are popular. But a diminishing of the wealth that we could be receiving from what would appropriately be our collective culture.
So when, let's say when Gilead was published, I remember thinking, wow, this is a reminder of all the things about Protestant Christianity in the Middle West that aren't being said now. That tradition has been reduced to caricature. And you've said elsewhere that you didn't intend to do it that way. You just took an interest in this Reverend Ames. But in a sense, was the book a balm or a blessing for you to write about that forgotten history?
Absolutely, no question. And I did all the research behind the book before I had any thought of writing the book. You know, when I thought of John Ames, he sort of precipitated all sorts of things that I had just pursued out of my own curiosity. But, you know, it's strange. I mean, I think I have been very fortunate, perhaps, but I've never myself felt as if I were terrified or vulgarized or in any way sort of, I was never offered cheap religion. And I, you know, in a gentle, quiet, thoughtful way, I feel that I have been sort of drawn along over the decades of my life by thoughtful, well-intended people. And I think that, you know, most people who hate religion have had a bad experience of it. I think that's true. Most people who love it have had an appropriate experience of it. I think that we talk about, you know, creeping secularism and everything, but the major problem of religion, I think, is among people who identify with it in order to exploit it in one way or another. But I wanted to, you know, I wanted to give the sense of a life lived around religious assumptions that are beautiful, that are worthy of any amount of thought and attention.
You get the sense from the two novels that religion has been in some way good for everybody in the book except for Jack, and that's the whole drama of the two books. Is in many novels, let's say, the conflict is between religion and irreligion, between different kinds of religion. Here, people share certain assumptions about Christianity, and their test for each other is whether people were really acting as Christians, but they are held to a common standard in a way that we don't see in many other books. Is that part of the design?
Well, I mean, Boughton and Ames, again, both of them were just sort of strong figures in my imagination. And frankly, I felt secure writing from both theological perspectives because they're about a quarter of an inch apart. But one of the things, I mean, speaking of intention, one of the things that I have become aware of, because I'm often in settings where religion is discussed, is that I have a very strong affection and loyalty to what is called secularism, a secular institution. I know many, 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 many people who authentically deserve to be described in that word, whom I cannot imagine that God would not love. I have no conception of God that would not include love for these people, you know? And this is a mystery for me. It's probably as big a challenge to my religious assumptions over time as anything have been. And finally I thought, I'm going to test this. If you write a character, if people love Jack Boughton, God loves Jack Boughton. You know, I mean, he is what he is. There's nothing sinister. Well, he's not a great guy. But, you know, neither was Jacob, you know. So in a way, I was making a lovable character. I mean, lovable in not the usual sense, who was at the same time not religious by the standards, or who knows, not religious by the standards of people around him, not able to claim religion.
And then it seems like a test in the other direction, too, that if you could write a person as frankly pious as Reverend Ames and have a general recognition of his goodness, that suggests that our categories are too small, that we overgeneralize?
Absolutely. I think if there's one thing that I can assume about God, it's big categories.
Your fiction is so affirmative, and I mean in a deep way. The holiness of creation, the value of people to each other and to God, the power of everyday experience and the way it opens to transcendence or incandescence, as you put it. Your essays you describe as contrarian in method and spirit. does the one beget the other? Do the essays clear the way for the fiction, or how do they work together?
Well, a lot of the things that I criticize, I think, are in their impact inhumane. My loyalty really is to human loveliness and the deep experience of self that every self deserves, you know, and the deep acknowledgement that everyone owes to everyone else. And I think that there's a great deal in the culture that dissuades us or distracts us from these kinds of experiences. That's what my essays tend to be about.
So in a sense, they're trying to recall us to the things that are more obviously affirmed in the novels.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But how about in your career? Whenever I've heard it said twice today, people asked about those years when you supposedly were silent, and you said, "Well, I was writing on fiction." How does it work for an artist you spent years and years after the two books, well, especially after Housekeeping, followed 9 years later by Mother Country. I began to think of Hawthorne's 10 years after he graduated from college, in which not much was heard from him, but Henry James reckoned those the most powerful years of his life. Can you tell us a little about that time, a time of reading and re-education?
Well, you know, it was after I finished my PhD that I settled down to re-educate myself, because I felt as if there were too many things that I didn't know, and too many things that I had been told that I could not truly believe in as meaningful. Too much that was taught to me as authoritative when it seemed to me there were no grounds for authority. And then that long, long list of books that everyone talks about as if he or she had read them. So I read Capital, you know, Marx. I read Condition of the Working Class in Manchester. I read The Theory of Population, you know, Malthus. I read The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man. I just read through this whole sort of list of everything that everybody talks about as if they already knew, you know. It was wonderful, and one of the things you realize is that they really haven't read those books, and that I mean, I went to very good schools. I mean, earnest people teaching in good faith, but the fact is that there are these sort of little short phrases that stand in for major influential works. And these phrases are often totally inaccurate, even 180 degrees wrong. And so you have this sort of matchstick structure, you know, that you simply can't navigate by. I mean, you can, you know, you just begin to feel the falseness of it. My initiation into all this was writing a dissertation on Shakespeare and reading what the critics in the English world were writing about these plays, and then simply reading the source material. And, you know, reading the chronicles, reading, you know, Thomas More and all these people. And there was obviously such a profound cleavage between the two. References were made that were totally inappropriate, could not be made if there were any sense of context. So I thought, well, if that's how they do Shakespeare, then what else should I be looking at? I wanted my own mind. I didn't want a mind that had been stashed with somebody else's shorthand or the fifth recurrence in a freshman history class of a book that nobody had read for 5 generations.
Did you ever have to defend yourself doing this? All the while you had teaching jobs, and people must have been asking you, or did you read such a book that was published last month?
Well, I've been very fortunate. You know, the University of Iowa is where I've taught for the most part, and I'm in, you know, of course, the workshop in creative writing. They just, I mean, I'm the only, on the fiction side, I'm the only English PhD. One is from Harvard Law School, one's from Harvard Medical School. You know, all these other people have these wonderful other qualifications. But I was kind of the eccentric in the group, in a way. I mean, that's not, we're all eccentric. I wouldn't want to claim that for myself, but they're very latitudinarian because they assume that we're in kind of an unusual group, you know? And I've never felt it at any moment that I was discouraged from anything that I tried to do or even tried to teach.
Is there any connection between that program of reading and the insistence of Protestantism that you read the primary text?
I think it was in many ways a very Protestant undertaking. A great belief in fallibility settled over me, you know, and I had to struggle out of it as I could.
It was also, the way you describe it at least, very German, that you ask at one point, where did religion go? And what happened to a lot of the assumptions about American religion that were passed on? And just on my way down here on the train, I began to think to myself, well, for several generations, people read these German texts. And then possibly after World War II, that attention toward German university culture as the measure of what's best was withdrawn, and something else replaced it without anyone saying why. But many of the texts you read, Nietzsche, Feuerbach, it was a 19th century German education, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think, I mean, you know, Karl Barth, of course, is still very much admired and so on. But I think that this terrible anxiety settled over the country when we decided that Europe was becoming secular and therefore we must become secular. There was some sort of historical inevitability that we would sort of stream along behind whatever the Europeans did. I think that because of that anxiety, there was an impulse to popularize religion, to make it into something that makes you feel good. And you know what I mean? As if the intellectual content of it would drive people away. When in fact, I think the intellectual content attracted many people very profoundly, you know. But these kinds of assumptions that you have to condescend to people, and that's absolutely what it amounts to, have been very destructive, I think, of religious culture generally.
Right. I mean, you depict in the novels a small community in Iowa that's sufficiently convinced of the value of intellectual life to sponsor a student to go over to Göttingen and remain there, even if he comes back without his faith. That's the risk they're willing to take for the faith of the Iowa community to be sufficiently well-rooted. Mm-hmm. And that's something that it's just not as common today. No. A lot of churches do sponsor students still. I don't know where I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they sent them to Germany or somewhere. But that is the idea that you have to, you know, create the intellectual core of your own culture in order to perpetuate it. You still find that, but it's not anywhere near as strong, I think, as it was in the 19th century. We often hear people blaming the culture or American secular culture for keeping voices out. You seem to suggest there's a different explanation. You told The Atlantic that 50 years ago, the two most important Protestant theologians were Tillich and Niebuhr, and today the most important Protestant American theologians are Tillich and Niebuhr. Now both of them long dead. Any way you can account for that?
Well, I think that confidence was lost in theology as a project. You know, even though Tillich and Niebuhr both filled very honorable roles in their time as public intellectuals, not simply as theologians, you know. They had the kind of depth and the kind of dignity that actually allowed them to function as public intellectuals. And there's I don't know where that type of person has gone. Any volunteers in the audience would be, but it's a pity. I mean, for some reason, the very idea of intellectualism as something that was an affirmative part of the culture and not simply elitism, as they say now, that the idea that has vanished, I think, is enormously degrading to religious culture as a whole.
Ames has often been described in terms of his serenity, his inwardness, his depth, his piety. There's also a lot of anxiety in his letter to his son, and to what extent is that anxiety fearful about this? You know, is he afraid of the loss that we're talking about, that the things that are dearest to him aren't going to be communicated to his son because he won't be around to do it himself?
I think that one of the anxieties that people have who value their own culture is that they will fail to propagate it into the next generations, you know. I mean, every culture is vulnerable generation to generation. A lot of his anxiety, of course, is simply the feeling of helplessness that he's launching this child into the world and has no means to protect him. I think that's kind of something that we feel in less or more extreme forms, any of us who have children.
Do you think how is it that, if it is so, why is it that ideas about religion and its place in society, about the soul, about the incandescence of creation, they seem, if communicated in essays and then in a novel, they seem to be received in very, very different ways. Of course, fiction and nonfiction are different, but what I'm suggesting is that they're welcomed in fiction in a way that they're not in essays. If that's so, do you have any idea why?
I think partly perhaps because they've become very abstract as words. I mean, one of the problems about writing about anything religious is that there's such an insistent repetition of certain terms of religious thought, or, you know, terms that come out of the culture, that if you can't embody them, they sound like cant. You know, it just sounds like you're saying something doctrinal that other people have no way of imagining a meaning for, you know.
So in other words, if you've got Reverend Ames with his cat and his son and his much younger wife and his church that moves him simply with the sound of its creaking floorboards, the ideas about water as an aspect of blessing are somehow incarnated much more fully for the reader, and so the reader can grasp them?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you know, like before when we were talking about benediction, you know, if someone simply watches it, it just looks like a ritual gesture. But if they can imagine what the content of it would be, then it becomes something else.
Do you think there's anything, I wondered reading the books whether simply the notion that Christianity is actually making truth claims is not, that edge is blunted a little bit in fiction, blunted enough for the reader to find his or her way into the book until the fact that they are actually truth claims is really felt. Apparently it's not something you've done intentionally, but can you speak to that at all?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's truth in truth, you know, which is one of the problems with the way that the conversation about religion has gone in the last century, so less than that perhaps. There's the truth of the fact that experience is beautiful and that love is profound and that we are vulnerable and small in the order of things and perhaps very grand in the transcendent order, you know. I think people have that intuition whether they're religious or not. Amazing number of people have said, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in the soul, you know, which is it's interesting. But in any case, you know, people hang religion on, you know, a seventh-day creation or sixth-day creation the circumstances of the birth of Jesus or something like that. But I think that there's a much deeper truth that speaks over that whole catalog of particulars that has to do with the fact that the great drama of God was enacted among human beings, you know. That is a much more, that raises the meaning of truth to another level of persuasion in a way, you know. I mean, a palpable, you know, presence. And I think that religious people tend to get hung up on making whatever they consider to be the crucial argument of truth, by which they tend to mean fact, you know. And they forget that the whole beautiful life of the religion occurs at another level that has to do with, you know, a father releasing his son into the world to bear its burdens, you know, which is one way in which that narrative is articulated.
And from what you said earlier, that's the level on which your imagination is working when you're writing about Reverend Ames or Reverend Boughton. You're thinking primarily what happens next, or how are these characters going to meet again, or do you think in the terms that you've put out in your essays as you're writing a piece of fiction?
Oh no, I write my fiction completely differently from how I write my essays. There are certain things, you know, it's sort of like when you write a sonnet or when you write a piece of music or anything like that, just you make certain decisions that create the rules that pertain. You know, I can't suddenly have these characters depart from themselves culturally or in terms of personality or anything like that. But what I primarily respect when I'm writing is the sense of the integrity of their personalities and their circumstances. And I would not do anything to make this situation I'm describing essentially obedient to any other considerations.
Right, and I guess that's what I'm trying to push past. It's different from your nonfiction, certainly, but in no way are you smuggling these ideas in fiction. It's just something else altogether that's going on. Following, you know, if Reverend Ames would say the Lord, or the good Lord, that it's just a matter of what words he would use, and those are the ones that you put down, capturing his voice.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I have to have the voice. I always write from the voice. If that fails me, I just have to put the whole thing away.
You mentioned at lunch that you've been writing some pieces about economics, and that all of them haven't been republished, but in your published work, you've explained the situation of our country aphoristically as well as anybody, that the anti-Darwinists are the social Darwinists. The very people who are against Darwin and the teaching of Darwin in the schools have a Darwinian account of how money is acquired.
It's true.
Is this, how do we get here? Is it in some respects because of the loss of the cultural inheritance that's just so vivid in your books?
That's a real question for me. There are things that I absolutely don't understand. Why religious people of a certain significant section of religious people have identified with the Second Amendment so passionately. You'd think it was the Second Commandment, you know? That's just bizarre to me. I mean, and the patriotic people are the ones that want to carry a concealed weapon in case there's an American they'd like to shoot, you know? I mean, none of this makes sense to me. And I've never been able, I mean, one of the things that we do in this country, or any country no doubt, is that we self-segregate into sort of affinity groups, you know. So I literally don't know anyone who understands this thing about the Second Amendment, you know. I mean, you know, 23 people lie dead and somebody says, but the Second Amendment, you know what I mean? Mexico burst into gunfire, the Second Amendment. I'd like to have a nice talk with one of these people, and frankly, I think that I tend to travel with my pack and they travel with theirs, you know, and I have no insight into it.
Another thing that comes up again and again is the role played by Christian revivalists in the First and Second Great Awakenings in founding universities like Princeton, Dartmouth, Oberlin. And the suggestion, in the essays at least, is that in some respects those universities are not in touch with their religious character the way they once were. The hope at Georgetown is that that's not the case, and that that religious character is going to be sustained. Do you have any anything to suggest as people here go about that?
Well, you know, I was at Brown when they were having this conversation about whether they actually had a right to retain their Protestant character, and they decided they didn't really, you know. I think that universities feel a point where their role in credentialing people is so important that they are basically practicing an unacceptable form of religious exclusivism if they don't accept a broad variety of students, or if they, you know, or if they try to make the students into their paradigm Protestant or Catholic or whatever before they send them out into the world. I think that, I mean, all of the, you know, Harvard, Yale, all these schools that were so important in early Protestant culture in America became, in effect, such powerful institutions that to exclude people on the basis of their religions, or to, you know, it felt undemocratic simply, you know. I think this has been a problem for Protestantism because it really is a severe intellectual loss, I think. Even that, the fact that there was some embarrassment that came to be associated. I'm probably not telling you anything you haven't encountered in one form or another. The idea of trying to claim a Protestant identity for these very, very important Protestant institutions. I think that a meaningful diversity within the culture can mean that within the culture there have to be diverse institutions, you know. I mean, I think it's a mistake. I don't think the culture is better off for Protestantism basically to have surrendered its intellectual capital so much. I don't think it would be better off for the Catholics to do the same either. I think that we have to have all kinds of conversation with one another. But I think that there's a way in which, and I think it's quite visible now, that the health of every religious institution has a positive consequence for the health of every other religious institution. That we have to be able to sustain a high-level conversation that actually is faithful to profound traditions. You know, there are so many voices in this culture. They come from so many directions. If they're richly informed and able to speak from a particular perspective, I think everybody's better off for that.
You've spent this past few months in New York City, in one of the most diverse parts of the city, and just following on what you just said, that's a place where it's ethnically diverse but religiously diverse as probably no place in the United States. Can you give us a few impressions? This is Queens.
Well, I always enjoy being there. I mean, it's and you know, my son and daughter-in-law go to a Dutch Reformed church, a very liberal version of Dutch Reformed. And this little building, you know, standing there with its little white steeple in the middle of Astoria. And the congregation that meets after them is Korean, and the congregation that meets before them is Greek. There's a Greek Protestant congregation there also. And you know, it's a very rich sort of vitality of all these people sort of collaborating in their collective, you know, well-being and so on. I think in general Americans do like a diverse surrounding. I like the idea of Muslim women taking their kids out trick-or-treating, you know. The woman veiled and the child dressed as a pumpkin, you know. But you know, it's a big country, and it deserves its variety. It really does. I mean, in the sense that some places will be mingled like Astoria, and some places will be less obviously so, like perhaps Iowa. I'm very proud of Iowa lately.
And I was proud of you. Should we take a few questions?
Yes. Oh, this is mine.
Yeah. We talked about the resurrection of the ordinary. In Home, it seems to me one of the, I got this from my daughter, who read it very perceptively, I think, that one of the defining moments is the serving of chicken dumplings in the bout in Home. And in conversations back and forth, we sort of come up with it as the idea of covenant, the idea that God, no matter what our fallacies are, ultimately offers our home, that he will be our God. Was this on your mind when you wrote this?
Well, I mean, that's of course a very important assumption that I do always have. I wasn't thinking of the chicken and dumplings specifically, but I do think that there's a deeply covenantal quality to a home, you know, that, you know, it's a non-conditional circumstance, ideally.
Hi, I just finished Gilead yesterday. Actually, I loved it, and I was wondering. I'm the son of a Protestant preacher from a country, actually, and reading the book made me view my own dad in a slightly different way. And I was wondering, how did you get into the mind of this man who's had this many experiences, and how did you explain them so freely?
Well, you know, I read a lot of theology, and then one day I was in a hotel room in Provincetown, Massachusetts, waiting for Christmas, and instead I got John Ames, which was a pretty nice present, really. I don't know where these things come from. I had only written Housekeeping previously to that in terms of fiction, and it surprised me to death that I had a male narrator. But it was very nice.
I hope it's not too personal, but I'm interested in the kind of accompaniment of the holy or prayer, or how that spirituality fits into your writing process. It's kind of beyond the writing process. What's going on inside of you in terms of your own spiritual journey as you write?
Well, I think of the writing again as being basically exploratory. You know, I mean, I have, you know, as people do, I live with a conception of God. I mean, all the words are poor, but you know, God is a given, shall we say? You know, but you know, that's something that you accept as a sort of short statement. But you think, what does that mean? You know, how is that felt? And then you think, water, what is that? You know, it's just a way of, I mean, writing for me is very often a way of exploring ideas or exploring, you know, a sense of things. So there is nothing auxiliary, sort of. There is no, the writing itself is a kind of prayer, I think, probably. And self-examination in the sense of what is that I live with, you know, what is this assumption?
I wanted to thank you for Gilead. The old spiritual was right. There's a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. And I wanted to thank you especially for Reverend Ames. I'm learning many things from him, including, I hope, how to grow old more gracefully in all senses of that word. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
I was struck by the, in Housekeeping, it's centered on women, and then you have Gilead, and it deals with a lot of masculine themes, and they seem to come together really nicely in Home with this complementarity between men and women, particularly in a friendship between a brother and sister. There isn't really anything romantic there, as there often is in friendships between men and women, and I was just wondering if you could comment on this complementarity.
It did sort of occur to me that brother-sister relationships are not explored in literature. They're really not. I have a brother, an older brother, and when I was young, he was very, very important to me. He was the one that was always handing me books and, you know, and giving me lectures about art and all these kinds of things. And I think that it can be an extraordinarily deep relationship, and you don't see it represented, you know. And then, of course, there was a certain amount built into Gilead that already put them in the house together and so on, you know. I don't know if that's a very adequate answer to your question. I think that you know, it's a little touchy sometimes for some people because she is a woman in 1956 and she has you know, the options that women had then, and also the sort of role that women had then, which was comforting and feeding, and I think those are very sacred things. You know, I mean, obviously, I'm glad to have other options as well, but the fact that they were associated with women, or to the extent that they still are, I don't think should in any way undercut just the pure value that they have.
If you could, I guess, prod American Christians to read one theologian, who might it be and why?
Oh my. You know, I have a very deep affection for Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom I consider to be not only a wonderful theologian, but also someone who really lived out what he believed and illuminated what he believed continuously in his life. I think that, I mean, I think that people that read Bonhoeffer are sort of possessed by Bonhoeffer, I think, often. You know, I mean, I love Karl Barth. There's nobody in the world that makes finer distinctions more elegantly than Karl Barth, but he's not the beginning place. And I think in terms of ethics and so on, I mean, the beauty of the conception of ethics and so on, I think Bonhoeffer's probably my man.
When you were talking about education, you talked about education, then coming, you know, going out and pursuing the education, then coming back and informing your culture. Whereas I feel like, personally, with a liberal arts education, a lot of times that makes me placeless in some respects. And so Gilead has such a strong sense of place. So I was wondering if you could talk about place in relation to education a little bit.
Well, you know, of course, I'm not an Iowan. You know, I spent a long time looking at that landscape to Iowanize myself, you know. But, I mean, there are ways in which we simply have to accept our circumstances as historically unparalleled. We do have enormous mobility. We have the great privilege of being able to move around anywhere in a huge country and pretty well feel at home there, you know. Which is so rare. I mean, if, like, Europeans, for example, are enormously localized and very hesitant to be anywhere but where they feel they belong and so on. So, and then, of course, you know, we have our other kinds of mobility that let us decide what we want to know or what we want to be good at, and then we have a map to look at, you know, about where we can practice the thing that we are capable of. So, if you look at it from a positive point of view, being unplaced is extraordinary, you know. It's something that no other generation would have experienced in quite the same way. So, you know, other generations had other comforts, but I think that this odd situation of ours is full of value, and it's not a very helpful nostalgia to wish we were, in effect, less free, you know?
I very much like the resurrection of the ordinary. One of the things, though, that I wonder about is the problem of evil. And there's an awful lot of the ordinary and not ordinary that's really nasty and ugly and, I think, unredeemable. And sometimes I'm only about halfway through Home, so I don't know what happens in the rest of Home. In Gilead, I think it really turns up in Housekeeping. I see it in a submerged way in Gilead. It seems to me that though I'm a little puzzled now by your claim that Jack is a great guy, because it seems that acknowledgement of it turns up in Gilead partly because of Jack's abandoning of a child that essentially dies because of his abandonment of it, or at least that's how I read it. So I just wonder if you could talk about whether you've struggled with that problem of evil, or whether your confidence in the afterlife, or Calvin's confidence in the afterlife at least, it sort of erases it as a concern.
I think I said Jack was not a great guy. I think I compared him to Jacob, you know, whom, of course, God loved. There are things that, I mean, of course, what Jack does in relation to that girl is absolutely bad, you know. But the fact is that life goes on after you've done something absolutely bad, you know. And people have to, you know, people can't throw you to the wolves or put you in a pit and abandon you or anything. There you are. There the fact is. There your father is, you know. I think it's a great question what forgiveness amounts to. And I think it's a question that, for example, Boughton never answers to his satisfaction, simply because he loved the little girl, you know. He felt very deeply the harm that Jack had done. I think that we all have to assume that we have probably done one thing or another, or things in accumulation that we radically ought not to have done. And I think that that is a point at which the conception of grace has to enter, you know. I was thinking, you know, I mean, and Jack thinks of it in Home, of the narrative of David and Bathsheba and the child that dies, you know. Over and over again in the Bible, people who are major, who are important to the whole covenant activity of God, do things that they really shouldn't have done, you know. And then what do? I mean, is it Christian to have that person live in some perpetual state of condemnation? Or is it Christian to say, this is God's child, i.e. Jack is God's child, I have to cherish him, and his errors are God's to attend to, you know? I would tend toward the latter myself. I don't think, I mean, I think this is part of being a good Calvinist, but I really think that most of us have enough strikes against us that we're not in the position of forbidding charity to virtually anybody.
Let me bring our conversation to a close this afternoon by some words of gratitude. First, to Marilynne Robinson for your vision and for your witness, for your work, and for your presence here with us today. And to Paul for a beautiful conversation that you guided with an extraordinary woman, an extraordinary artist and creative and imaginative leader in the world of culture today. Paul had this conversation is part of a series that we've launched here at the university, and we're in very good hands with Paul Elie. And finally, to all of you for your presence here today, to be here, to be part of this beautiful conversation that was moving and grace-filled, and one that I'm sure we will not soon forget. We have a reception to follow right outside in the President's Hall, and we look forward to welcoming you there. And again, I wish to express my sincere appreciation to Marilynne Robinson and Paul Elie for this beautiful conversation today. Thank you.